Hello, I'm Keith David Watenpaugh. I'm a historian at UC Davis, and I direct our Human Rights Initiative. At the outset, I want to thank Cyrus and Andrew for permitting me to participate in this important event in this non-traditional fashion. As I explained to Cyrus, and as some of you may be aware, in addition to my work as a professional historian, I have become deeply involved in international efforts to address the needs of refugee and internally displaced Syrian university students and teachers. Let me take, therefore, a minute of my 10 to explain why I'm on the screen and not there in person. As this conference is taking place, I am scheduled to take part in a European Union and Union for the Mediterranean planning meeting in Barcelona to generate opportunities around the Mediterranean for refugee students to continue and complete their studies. It's a very modest effort to address a small element of the larger humanitarian crisis created by the war in Syria. Our hope is to maintain some amount of the human potential represented by refugee university students in the hope, then, that they can return to and help rebuild a post-conflict Syria. I would encourage those of you who can to explore with the academic leadership of your institutions to the possibilities of hosting Syrian students, helping those already in refuge here, and collaborating with the Scholar Rescue Fund to provide space for endangered professionals. I can certainly provide additional information and assistance upon request. The first week of October, I'll be discussing this work at an event at the New School in Manhattan, and I will be at the annual meetings of both the Middle East Studies Association in New Orleans and at the American Historical Association meeting in Washington, D.C. As part of that work, I traveled last April to the vast Zaatari refugee camp in northern Jordan to meet with several dozen refugee college students. At that time, over 100,000 people were living there. That number is even larger now. As you might imagine, that visit has left a deep impression upon me, and not just in terms of how it shaped my humanitarian advocacy. As a historian, that visit, the conversations with Jordanians, some in government, and the mix of fear, hate, and anxiety they expressed about the Syrian refugees confirmed for me how critical the lived historical experience of refugees and the way states and societies encounter the refugee is to the broader political and social history of the post-Ottoman Eastern Mediterranean. Hannah Arendt's thought is critical to the way refugees have been understood in European history, and her most important argument is that the refugee is a product of authoritarianism and totalitarianism whose very being calls into question the way liberal democracy lays claim to both universal rights and national sovereignty. But there's another aspect of her work that is more important in the study of refugees in the interwar Eastern Mediterranean, one that is certainly more personal and evocative of her own experience with being stateless, with humanitarian rescue and asylum. Once they, she writes of the refugees in the origins of totalitarianism, had left their homeland, they remained homeless. Once they had left their state, they became stateless. Once they had been deprived of their human rights, they were rightless, the scum of the earth. Refugees are a problem. They're a problem for nation states, for host populations, for international institutions. They're often a problem for each other, as evidenced by the rise of organized crime and the sale of adolescent girls as brides in the Zaatari refugee camp. Yet this permanent impermanence, statelessness, rightlessness, abjection, have all been critical historical engines in the region, and there is even a kind of corsi e ricorsi feel to that history. What we see now at a place like Zaatari resonates with what happened to Iraqis a decade ago, Palestinians 55 years before that, and another half century before that with the Armenians. And I think that there might be a certain wisdom to reimagining the history of the last 100 years in the region through the lens of the refugee experience. The paper I submitted to this conference is drawn from my book project, Bread from Stones, The Middle East and the Making of Modern Humanitarianism, which the University of California Press is publishing this next fall. I've explored these ideas as well in articles in the American Historical Review, Humanity, and the Journal of Human Rights. This particular piece is set against the backdrop of the international failure in the post-World War I settlement to establish for the post-genocide Armenians of the Ottoman Empire a national home. I argue in the paper that while the relationship between Armenians in Armenia and the League of Nations, especially in the League's first decade, bears out a history in which Armenian national aspirations were abandoned, shifting and evolving member states' attitudes and League policies still affected the status, position, and even survival of Armenian refugee communities and individuals. In the face of the failure of the victors of the Great War to secure the establishment of Armenia, that is, a state for Armenians, understood at the time as the preeminent vehicle for the achievement of national aspirations, the League of Nations formulated a sui generis humanitarianism on behalf of the Armenians. This unique humanitarian enterprise, A, asserted the national rights of the Armenians, B, explicitly linked the League of Nations to the communal survival of that Armenian nation, and C, sought to achieve that survival by promoting the collective and individual welfare of Armenian refugees. The emphasis on communal survival rather than just assimilation distinguishes this project from the policies the League developed on behalf of Russian refugees during the same period. Still, despite the unique nature of this policy, elements of it intersect with other questions relative to interwar humanitarianism, including the treatment of Jews facing de facto denationalization from the states of Eastern and Central Europe, the extension of citizenship to refugees or migrants in colonial states, and the relationship between international organizations and the concept of civilian protection in times of peace. The convergence of colonialism, nationalism, and communal survival in the League's work also marks the interwar period as somewhat distinct in the genealogy of humanitarianism itself, and certainly distinguishes it from the humanitarian practices elaborated in the decades following the Second World War, when concepts like national self-determination were absent altogether, and a regime of individual human rights had some influence on the ambit of humanitarianism. More broadly, what the history of humanitarianism in the 20s and 30s confirms is that modern humanitarianism, as an ideology and a collection of practices, cannot and could not escape the prevailing cultural norms and moral economies and politics encircling it. It is shaped by the forces that act upon it and consequently can exert minor force, perhaps only in the form of resistance by its practitioners or its subjects, the other way. In the end, while this early humanitarian response was marked by unique departures from previous forms of relief and assistance, and is at odds with elements of the form of contemporary practices, what happened to the Armenians is an early example of what contemporary relief or development workers would call the substitution of humanitarianism for politics. Beyond explaining how modern humanitarianism began to take shape in the interwar period, the multifaceted relationship between the League and the Armenians constituted a proving ground where prevailing ideas about minorities, refugees, and concepts of cultural and national survival played out in the wake of World War II and the colonial division of the Middle East into League of Nations mandates. At the same time, as the League of Nations elaborated a series of novel projects to address Armenian suffering, the ideological content of interwar modern humanitarianism becomes clearer. Critical to that understanding is showing where the humanitarianism of that moment intersected with prevailing and evolving conceptions of human dignity and shared humanity, as well as how it was ultimately subordinated to the demands of 20th century nationalism and the persistence of late colonialism. Here I would like to highlight an element of this subordination in the way the mandate states, primarily France, but also Britain in Palestine and Iraq, viewed refugees as possible adjuncts to colonial rule. I've explored this idea in my first book, Being Modern in the Middle East, with the conceptual tool of the survivor's bargain, where abject and vulnerable populations collaborate with colonialism to survive. One of the aspects of that history is the degree to which refugees themselves exhibited agency in negotiating that relationship. They weren't unthinking tools of colonialism as nationalist historiography might suggest. Equally, the colonial archival sources and archives themselves are often unable or unwilling to acknowledge that very agency. This brings me to my concluding and I hope somewhat provocative thought. While the focus of this paper is primarily on the League of Nations engagement with the Armenian survivor communities of the Middle East, rather than the engagement of Armenians worldwide with the League of Nations, it is critical to note that Armenians as individuals and through international organizations, like the Armenian General Benevolent Union, shaped and reshaped the relationship with the League and asserted a degree of agency, which is often missing from the accounts found in the League's own archives. This periodic silence in the archive of the League shows that despite its origins in an international organization, it is still very much a colonial archive. As a colonial archive, it tends to flatten the historical experience of the peoples in the Middle East to whom its programs and policies were directed. Often, studies of the League's work in the region as a consequence of a failure to employ local sources, Turkish, Armenian, Arabic, and Kurdish, also fail to grasp how the League functioned to facilitate European domination of the non-West. This approach tends to ignore the League of Nations' sometimes overt and sometimes subtle paternalism and the role it played in legitimizing and perpetuating colonialism in the form of the mandates. Critically, as a new history of the League of Nations and the mandates emerges, it should interrogate and, where necessary, reverse altogether the way in which the archive constructed its own reality. In addition, as the League of Nations archive is vast, better preserved and accessible than other indigenous archives, itself sometimes a function of colonialism, we should be conscious of how that might skew the way we formulate basic historical questions. Thank you.